Welcome to the Principles of Economics. I'm looking forward to this course, which is about the whole subject of economics from beginning to end at the introductory level. It covers a lot of interesting topics, which I think you'll find interesting. One thing I'd like to make sure at the start is people know what the goal of the course is. And I'd like to think of it as you want to learn to use economic analysis to address the really important, interesting issues of the day. And to use that analysis to get some conclusions, some really concrete conclusions about what policy should be or what's really going on. Read about these ideas or concepts in the newspaper all the time, but here are the ideas to apply that economic idea and theory to it. In a sense, what you want to do is learn to think like an economist, but not just think like an economist, but do like an economist, to analyze a public policy problem, whether it has to do with healthcare or the Fed, and really do the kind of what economists do. Learn to think like an economist. That's the goal, and I think you'll find it fascinating. We like to emphasize not just the theory of economics, but the facts. What has been happening in the US economy, what's been happening in the Chinese economy, what's happening all over the world, what's happening to individual people, individual firms. Those are the facts that you need to think about, but the facts without the theory are not going to get us anywhere. I also like to emphasize that talking about economics, communicating the subject, is really important. It's one thing to get it in your head and understand it. It's another thing to be able to explain it to someone else or to make your case for the kind of policy that you'd like to bring into play. So that communication is really important. I like to emphasize that you use the words of economics. And so when you're thinking about this course and you hear something that I say, think about repeating it back in the case of an issue that you might be worried about. I've been doing economics for a long time as a professor and doing public policy, advising, and I say I really love this subject. I love economics, and I'd say this is going to be a successful course if I convince you to love economics the way I do, or at least to have you understand why I love this subject so much. Economics is usually thought of as divided into both microeconomic issues and macroeconomic issues. Micro ones are about individuals, individual firms, individual institutions, individual prices. So one question would be, why is the college tuition increased so much? Or what about this healthcare proposal that's out there? Is that good? What about all the debate that you're having? That's a more microeconomic topic. Housing, that housing boom we had a few years ago, which then busted, that's more microeconomic because it's about a sector of the economy or individual home purchases. Income distribution, how much the 1% get versus everybody else, that's more of a microeconomic topic too. In fact, one thing you might want to look at in thinking about this course is what's happened to the income distribution recently. So let me take a quick peek at that just to whet your appetite. This is a picture of the income distribution in the United States of America. It goes back to before 1920. And you can see on the vertical axis, it shows the percent of income earned by the top 1% in the United States. And if you look at this trends carefully, you can see that for a while, the income distribution spread out. That is, the share earned by the top 1% declined. And then it leveled off for quite a while, and then recently started to increase again. And in fact, now, if you look at these lines, the blue line or the red line, which are different because one includes capital gains, the income that you get by selling an asset, that's a capital gain. The other one is the blue line, doesn't include those capital gains. The stories are pretty much the same, but if you look carefully, you can see that, say, the amount earned by the top 1% as the most recent data, 2012, is as high as it's ever been in recent years. And so that's an interesting question from an economic perspective. Why did this happen? It's obviously very important. A lot of the Occupy Wall Street debate has to do with that. But we'd like to look at this question from the point of view of economics directly. In terms of this topic of economics, micro, macro, there's also the big picture types of things. And economists call that macroeconomics. So topics here include like the recession we had in the United States, in fact around the world from 2007 to 2009, and the recovery from that recession. We had a big down, we're getting back up again, but the recovery isn't really as great as people want, so some people call it the not so great recovery. Why is economic growth in China more than Africa? Well, why is the Chinese economy be doing well? That's kind of a macroeconomic question, the whole country of China versus the whole continent of Africa. Macroeconomics also has to do with monetary policy. That's really what the Federal Reserve does, or central banks in other countries. What the chair of the Federal Reserve is going to do, how powerful that job is, what's the role of the Federal Reserve. And macroeconomics also has to do with fiscal policy. That's the tax and spending and debt of the U.S. government and other governments for that part. You might want to take a look at the debt of the United States in recent years, because it's another phenomenon that economists are writing about and thinking about, and where in a course like this you can get some ideas. So this is a picture of the debt of the federal government of the United States as a share of our total gross domestic product, GDP. GDP is a measure of all the goods and services produced in the United States in a given year. And if you think of the debt as a percentage of GDP, it gives you a sense of how big the debt is compared to the United States, or the ability of the United States to pay back that debt. This chart goes way back to the founding of the United States in the late 1700s. And it goes into the future based on a projection of the Congressional Budget Office, as an agency in Washington that does a good job at forecasting based on what policy is. If you look at the vertical axis, you can see that it goes above 100%, 200%, way very high, at least into the future. The history is shown in blue, and you can see we had a peak in World War II. That was that peak in the blue line. And that peak basically was something that economists had thought about for a long time. Actually, if you now look to where we are now, we're already approaching or passing that peak. And if you look at the projections of the Congressional Budget Office, either in 2009 or more recently, it's very similar. So that's a concern. I always say if we ever got to that point in the United States, those high debt levels, they'd be so high we couldn't possibly service them. The United States of America wouldn't even be the United States of America. So this is a big issue, the macroeconomic kind of issue, which we're going to be addressing in this course. So one thing to keep in mind when you think about economics being divided into micro and macro is sometimes it's really hard to pull them apart that way. So many real-world examples involve both macro and micro. And one really good example of that is this massive financial crisis in the United States and other parts of the world in 2008 and 2009. That had to do with behavior of financial firms. That's kind of a micro topic, but it also had to do with the Federal Reserve as a macro topic. So to analyze some questions like this, in fact, there's quite a few, you need both micro and macro. And that's why this course is really going to cover both micro and macro. And as you'll see as we go, there'll be an integration between the subjects, which I think makes it interesting and also makes it something that makes the macro a little easier to understand. It follows a trend in research and teaching around the world that there's more micro in the macro, and we're going to be doing that in this course. So I hope you like it, and next lecture we're going to be talking about the basic mantra of economics.